Trump wants a ceasefire with Iran. Israel wants protection for its northern border communities and the threat of Hezbollah to go away, but Iran won't allow Hezbollah to be taken out of the battlefield.
Today is Monday, June 8th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Overnight, Iran fired ballistic missiles at Israel for the first time since the United States and Iran reached a tenuous ceasefire in early April. Israel responded with strikes inside Iran, targeting military sites and a petrochemical facility. The Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen then joined the fray, firing a missile toward Tel Aviv. Now, the immediate question is whether this is a brief exchange of blows or the beginning of a broader escalation. All of this comes after weeks of President Trump insisting that Washington and Tehran are close to a deal that could formally end the war. In reality, the two sides seem very far apart. Iran has yet to agree to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz or accept meaningful limits on its nuclear program. At the same time, Tehran is insisting that any agreement include an end to Israeli strikes on Hezbollah in Lebanon, something that is effectively a non-starter for Israel. Both the United States and Iran say that time is on their side, that economic pressure, political pressure, or internal weakness will eventually force the other to blink first. So where does this leave us? Are we watching the ceasefire begin to unravel, or simply another test of its limits? I'm joined today by Andrew Fox, a former British Army major who has spent years studying modern warfare, military strategy, and the evolving nature of conflict. Let's get into it. Andrew, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Thank you for having me on. Great to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on. Can you do us a favor, because it is your first time on the show, and just give us a brief bio of yourself?
Sure. So I'm a senior fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a think tank in London. My area of specialty is the Middle East, defence issues and psychology. Before that, I served for 16 years in the British Army, 3 tours of Afghanistan, and I was a paratrooper. So that's what led me to this current career path.
Man, you hit concise perfectly, and you are the perfect person to have on the show today, because a few days ago, people were asking whether this war between Israel, the United States, and Iran was winding down. And today we're wondering if we're watching the start of a new phase of the conflict. So what is your assessment on where things stand?
Look, I think we're seeing a very careful calibration on both sides. We had limited strikes from Iran yesterday, which were all intercepted by the Israelis. We had a very limited sort of 15-wave strike on Iran from Israel. And now Iran has announced that that's the end of hostilities as far as they're concerned. So we're back to that very carefully calibrated tit for tat that we saw kind of back in 2024. The complicating factor here, of course, is Lebanon and Israel's fight against Hezbollah. We've got the evacuated communities in the north. We've got that unsafe northern border of Israel. We've got Hezbollah, which is, of course, a direct proxy of Tehran and the Iranian regime. And it's a really awkward bind because Trump wants a ceasefire between Iran and the United States and Israel as well. Iran are keeping the fight going in Lebanon. And so what they're doing is sucking the Israelis into this long campaign in Lebanon and then using it as an excuse to delay the ceasefire negotiations with Trump. So it's this balancing act that we're seeing play out in front of us.
So let me go back even further than you did. You were talking about the last 24 hours. I'm going to just broaden the timeline a bit. Israel says that if Hezbollah continues to fire on northern Israel, it threatened to strike Beirut. And Hezbollah has been firing at Israel nonstop, including using these drones that are picking off soldiers almost on a daily basis. Iran then warns that if Israel hits Beirut, it's going to respond directly. Now, Hezbollah keeps firing, and so Israel does what it said it was going to do, and it hit a Hezbollah headquarters in a Beirut suburbs. Iran then does what it says it was going to do. It launched the ballistic missiles at Israel. First, Trump says, I'm going to call Bibi and say nobody fires back. But Israel does retaliate, and it strikes inside Iran. Then the Houthis jump in. We'd forgotten about them for a moment, and they fire at Tel Aviv. Now, as you said, there was no injuries. There was no major damage. And now Israel and the United States are saying it's over. And Iran says, okay, well, it's over for us if it's over for you. But they seem determined to link the two fronts, to essentially say, if Israel is hitting Lebanon, we treat that as if it's an attack on Iran, and we reserve the right to retaliate.
Yeah, just so. We have to contextualize this in the last 2.5 years and how this is one front. Now, this has been lost, I think, in international debate, mainly because of the obsessive focus on Gaza. But Gaza was just one front in a much wider war, as we all know. The plan was always for Iran to have this ring around Israel that could eventually attack them from all sides at once and destroy them. That plan was effectively interrupted by Sinwar launching 7th of October when he did against Hezbollah and Tehran's better instincts. But if you don't look at it in the round, you don't see the whole picture here. And that's why we're having the Houthis getting pulled in. That's why we're getting, all this pressure from Iran to keep Hezbollah alive. Because look, if they get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon, that takes away a huge weapon out of Iran's arsenal. And we're seeing just this week the perfect example of how Iran can leverage Hezbollah against Israel, even when they're not firing. They can use them on the diplomatic side, not just the military side. To lose them to whatever Israeli military action achieves is a real problem for them. So whilst they do want a ceasefire, and they do want to try and get some kind of deal out of Trump on the Iranian side, they also need to understand that Hezbollah are inextricably linked into Iranian wider plans, and they're not going to let them go without a fight, and that's what we're seeing.
Now, Israel, of course, can't accept the linkage that Iran wants to make, which essentially says that if Israel fires at Hezbollah, it's tantamount to an attack on Iran. And this, of course, puts the United States in a dilemma because it's trying to bring an end to this war. So how do we navigate this dynamics between these three parties?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And look, if I had the perfect answer for you, then I'd be the only person in the world that does, quite frankly.
I'd have an exclusive.
You would. Look, and you've perfectly articulated how challenging this problem is, because Trump wants a ceasefire with Iran. Israel wants protection for its northern border communities and the threat of Hezbollah to go away, but Iran won't allow Hezbollah to be taken out of the battlefield. And so we need to look at this. I think if we conceptually frame it in three ways: economic, diplomatic, and military. Economically, Iran is getting squeezed, but one thing that hasn't yet been struck is their infrastructure, things like that. So there's a way to ratchet up the economic pressure on Iran if they take that choice. Diplomatic, of course, is the ceasefire negotiations that are going on with Trump at the moment, and the possibility linking to economics that Iran gets paid to stop all of this, which is not a good outcome at all. Or there's the military option, which only looks like escalation at this point. So does America go back to full-scale bombing? Do we see an Israeli escalation in Lebanon as well at the same time to completely, I think people sort of call it finishing the job. But I would just pull out some real problems with all of these things. The first problem is that if militarily they escalate against the regime will escalate back. Now, I don't think we're hugely concerned about missiles at Israel. I mean, they're a huge inconvenience and a drain on Israelis, but they're not really scoring any hits. I think what we're far more concerned about is hits on Gulf states, oil infrastructure, potentially salination plants in the Gulf states.
Yes, with the caveat that there is all this talk about the degree to which there are interceptors, and they're not limitless, and they are expensive.
Exactly that, and that's the problem. And of course, they've also only got a 9 in 10 success rate. So 1 in every 10 is going to get through and cause damage. And we've seen that repeatedly. On top of that, economically, the clock is ticking on the Strait of Hormuz. We've got maybe 2 weeks left of global oil supply reserves. Once those expire, everyone's going to feel the pain. We're talking $150, $160 a barrel. That translates for Americans $6, $7, maybe even $8 a gallon at the pump, depending on how much tax you pay in your state. That also translates to more expensive prices at the supermarket, global inflationary surge. So that's a real problem with the economic side of things. And then, of course, on the diplomatic level, the challenges of negotiating with the Iranian regime are well documented. They drag negotiations out, they stall, they obfuscate, and they make things as hard as possible. So you ask me what the answer is. The bottom line is I don't know, but I can see why I don't know, because it's so complex and there are so many interlocking things, all of which have potentially a downside as well as a potential positive.
Yeah, and one other point from the perspective of the Israelis, for them, if Iran fires at them, they can't very well just sit there. Now, there is this whole dynamic of yesterday after Iran attacked, Trump goes public and says, I'm calling Bibi and telling him not to retaliate. Then Israel does, which always leads me to wonder, is that political theater? Is that intended to be a distraction to throw off the Iranians? Or this is a guy that's trying to make a deal. He doesn't want to see oil hit, $8 at the pumps ahead of a midterm. And it's hard to know exactly what is playing out between these two allies.
It can be both, of course. Trump can tell Bibi not to do something in the full knowledge that he's going to do it anyway. There was no doubt Israel was going to respond yesterday. I think you would have to be extremely foolish if you thought that Bibi was going to go, oh, okay, just fire missiles at us, it's fine. That wasn't going to happen. But there's also an element potentially of good cop, bad cop, where Trump can allow a response against the Iranian regime, but also maintain a sort of plausible deniability to keep the negotiations moving forwards.
And a public scolding looks like a point for Iran, which also helps them walk off the ledge.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's about finding that pathway to de-escalation, knowing that whatever happens, Israel is going to respond. And it doesn't bring it any closer to a proper answer to the question, but you can see how the statecraft and chess pieces are being moved, I think.
Now, President Trump has said that a ceasefire in the Middle East does not mean that everybody stops shooting, and that certainly seems to be the case. He continues to insist that a deal with Iran is close. Do you believe that?
I do, for two reasons. First of all, I think that any deal will be advantageous to the Iranians. I think they will get some sanctions relief or some clever framing of sanctions relief that doesn't look like Trump giving them money. Because, of course, he's been incredibly critical of the Obama deal where the cash was flown in. Like, he doesn't want anything that looks like that. So it'll be some sort of workaround that the Iranians do get some sanctions relief and it's still spun as an American victory. What that looks like, I don't know. But that's what I expect to see. Because the economic pressure on the world economy, as you say, $8 a gallon at the pump during a midterm election year is a serious problem.
Political suicide, yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention the rest of the world. And it's bad for Israel if the world economy goes off a cliff too. You know, Israelis will look at it from a security perspective, but actually Israelis will be hurt as well. And on top of that, Israel will be blamed for crashing the world economy if they are seen to prevent a ceasefire deal. So for a variety of reasons, I think it suits everyone to come to a deal. It's just what that deal looks like and how long the Iranians keep it for is the big question. And I don't expect that to be very long.
Well, let's talk about that because the original American war aims were to address Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and its proxy network. But that's no longer what the conversation is about. There's still conversation about the nuclear program. There's obviously now conversation about reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But the issue of the ballistic missiles and the proxy terror group seems to have just fallen off the table.
You have to go into a campaign with your goals bounded by what you can realistically achieve. And I think that's part of the problem here. I think regime change was absolutely a goal. They didn't state it openly. But if we look at all the sort of noise and reporting about the Kurds, the strike on day one, which killed all the Iranian leadership, like all of those things point, I think, towards a hope that there would be a regime change. And they didn't say it publicly because, frankly, it was unlikely to happen. And there were suggestions that the plan was changed at the last minute as well, and the Kurds were switched off and they weren't encouraged to launch their attack. But look, you are not going to delete Iran's entire ballistic missile capability with what the Americans and the Israelis had in theatre militarily. It just wasn't going to happen. You can severely degrade it. You can shut the entrances to those underground missile caverns. You can make sure that your defences are in a good place to sort of take out launchers as and when they pop up. All of these things are possible. So heavy degradation of that capability, but removing it completely is a fantasy. The big one for me, I think, where this deal for now lives or dies is on the nuclear material. Finding some sort of resolution to that highly enriched 60% nearly weapons grade HEU that poses such a threat. Again, you can't delete Iran's nuclear capability completely. They will always know how to make nuclear material. They will always know how to make the missiles to launch it. They will always have allies who will help them out if you kill their scientists. You know, China, North Korea, all of these countries will lean in. Pakistan is a nuclear power. You know, so you're not going to delete it completely. The question, I think, is can you degrade it? And then I think what you do next after the deal is really important. And this is where you start talking about regime change, but in a long-term way. How do you resource fund Iran's internal dissident groups whilst degrading the regime in order to create the conditions where they can be overthrown? It's not a quick solution. It's not an easy solution. It's not one that's guaranteed even to work. But I think that's what you try to do after the deal is signed, because Iran are a threat to not only the Middle East, but also the rest of the world through their terror networks and their crime networks worldwide. So they're a real problem they need dealing with. But unfortunately, this war chose the wrong option in the first instance to do that.
You know, on a day like today, I go on X and it seems like everybody is posing as an expert on military warfare, but I have an actual expert with me. So one of the big picture questions that I have is the way in which people often confuse tactical success with strategic success. So you can destroy infrastructure, you can, as you said, take out senior commanders or regime leaders, you can achieve battlefield dominance or air superiority as Israel has achieved over Iran. And that doesn't mean that you've actually accomplished your larger political objectives. So when we think about those larger objectives, what are the metrics that we should actually be looking at?
Another great question. It's articulated in terms of what we call ends, ways, and means. So ends is where you want to get to. Means is the physical things you do to get there, and ways is how you join them together to make one coherent operation to get you where you want to go. The success can be measured in terms of to what extent did you achieve your aims for the operation. If you remember that war is always political in objective, you don't just go to war to bomb stuff. You do it to try and coerce your enemy to bend to your will, effectively. So the big test at the end of this, well, how effectively was the Iranian regime bent to Trump or Jerusalem's will? And right now, the answer is not very. You have to understand the psychology of the Iranian regime. That, under their 12-verse Shia philosophy, they see suffering as a noble end in and of itself. They are achieving a religious goal by suffering at the hands of America and Israel. So everything that's happening to them, they frame as a win because they're being morally, religiously virtuous in their own eyes by suffering. So you have to understand that psychology first. It's very hard to bend someone to your will when they see your attempt to bend them as a good thing. Okay, that's an incredibly difficult psychological thing that we have to try and get around. So to what extent were the missile launchers degraded? To what extent was the highly enriched uranium handled, removed, diluted, whatever you want to do with it, or even just buried underground by multiple bombs? To what extent was the proxy network degraded? And I think when you look at that in the rounds, that will tell you how successful the operation has been. At the moment, the chances of removing all of those things are nil. So you have to look at them in terms of how much percentage they have now compared to what they had before the war, and how long it's going to take them to rebuild if they decide to do that.
I think this is what I'm worried about, because the people that are optimistic about how the war with Iran are going are pointing to, look, they don't have a navy anymore. All of the senior leaders were taken out, and they have their list of reasons. But you've sort of pointed to the issues that I'm looking at, which is this belief that suffering is noble. Cripple our economy. What do we care? The ability to now say, do you see why we need a nuclear program? We're being attacked by a superpower and its little Israeli puppet dog. So of course we need a nuclear program in order to defend itself. And they have patience, which is something that the West does not have. We think about midterm elections and economic pain at the gas pump, and that doesn't seem to be a problem for them. So in all these different ways, it sort of seems to me that Iran says, we look at the American administration, they're the only ones willing to go up against us, and they're politically afraid. And we can just wait out this president. We can see what happens in 2028 and who the next person is. And then Israel is caught in the middle of these two different forces, and it's severely restrained by what it's able to do.
Yeah, and the Iranians are strategically really clever. I think the fact that they are monsters makes us underrate them slightly, but they're very, very good at this incredibly long-term planning, as you say. They will absolutely be looking to the next presidential election and who wins it. They know that whatever comes next, it's not going to be Donald Trump and his unique way of approaching international affairs, shall we say. So the longer they can drag this out, the better it is for them. And look, if you're going to attack Iran, I think the mistake they've made here is not going all in. They failed to understand that Iran had their own escalatory options in terms of striking Gulf architecture.
And closing the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, exactly.
What would it have looked like to go all in? What would that have meant?
Look, I think that looks like first thing you do is seize Hormuz. You do everything you can to clear out those islands, to clear out the coastal defences, and you go as hard as you can there to make sure that stays open. And then you're looking at potentially ground forces from somewhere going in and physically overthrowing the regime. Like, none of that's easy. I'm not saying it's what they should have done. But if you're going to start a war with Iran, you have to understand that they will strike back. They've been preparing, a forward defensive strategy for nearly 15, 20 years, and they will hit the things that they know they can hit you. They will hit you in your pocket, and that's where we are. I don't think we can underestimate how bad it's going to be for our economies if this goes on very much longer. Like, incredibly, incredibly painful. Even the global south, we're looking at potentially famine. If we can't start getting fertilizer supplies flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Like, this is a catastrophe. And I think it's because they made a bunch of assumptions that the regime would fall quickly and wouldn't respond. Those assumptions have been proven to be false. And now here we are in this mess that you and I are trying to understand right now.
If you had the ability to give policy recommendations to President Trump, what would it be?
Invent a time machine and go back and do this very differently. Look, I don't have a policy. I think he has to take any deal he can right now, just because of the way the economics are going to go if he doesn't. So as long as that deal involves the highly enriched uranium, As long as it involves Iran's nuclear capability in the short term, that's good enough.
Even if it's an Obama-like deal that's 10 years.
Yeah, I think so.
Take it.
I'd take it at this point. Anything is better than nothing right now. And at the moment, they're staring down the barrel of nothing. That's how bad this has been messed up. So take what you can now. It has to include the uranium, even if it means paying for it. And then you can you can stop, reassess, reinvest if you need to. You can even look to after the midterms and maybe consider military action again once you've got that HEU out.
Highly enriched uranium.
That's right. Once the 60%, not far off, but weapons grade uranium. If you can get that out of the picture, then frankly, once you're past your election, once you're past the Football World Cup, then you can stop, reassess, and maybe re-engage if you think that's appropriate.
I know I said last question, but do you think that there's any chance that Iran would actually give up its highly enriched uranium?
I think if you pay them enough, I think that's what it'll come down to.
What's the figure they're asking for? 20 billion,
yeah,
23 billion?
It's something outrageous. It's going to be very painful for Trump, whether his ego will let him sign that deal, because it's very hard to spin that as a win. But look, you lose 26 billion by giving it to the Iranians, or you lose a hell of a lot more than that by the world economy going off a cliff. And that's the blunt fact calculus he's going to have to try and make here.
Andrew, it wasn't optimistic, but I enjoyed the conversation very much, and I hope you'll be back soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.